All right.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Talent Views, a virtual series where we talk to leaders in the field of all things talent. My name is Anu Rao, and I oversee marketing at the Indotronics Avani Group. What do we do? Well, we connect clients with best fit talent by providing staffing services to large corporations and government entities across the US, Canada, UK, and India. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome a very talented friend and an esteemed procurement professional, Paul Williams, to our virtual stage. Paul is the University of California Systemwide Procurement Chief Procurement Officer and Associate Vice President. In this role, Paul supports UC's mission of education, world research, and community impact with a particular focus on sustainability and supplier diversity. Paul has over 30 years of strategic sourcing, supply chain, and business process improvement experience at various companies, large names like Procter Gamble, Pfizer, Clorox, Mondelēz. He also has an understanding of small and diverse businesses through various roles like small business development volunteer in the US Peace Corps in Morocco, where he focused on economic development and women's entrepreneurship initiatives. Paul currently also serves on the executive advisory board of the Western Region Minority Supplier Development Council and on the board of the Global Humanity Summit. He has also served on the executive committee of the NYNJ MSDC. He also has given his time to a number of arts and economic empowerment programs, including Pop Up Circumstance, a global arts advocacy organization which he founded. His motto is To whom much is given, much is required. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Anu. It's great to see you and great to connect with you today.
Thank you. I would also like to introduce my colleague Michael Allen, who is the COO of Indotronics Avani UK, where he leads with the mission Talent Delivered for a Sustainable Future. He'll be hosting the part of the discussion when we start delving into the sustainability aspect of the discussion. As we go along the discussion, please put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A tab. With that, let's start with the very first question, Paul. Uh, would love to know a little bit about your current role, what it entails, and maybe comparing and contrasting with your private sector experience.
Okay, sure. So as you mentioned, the university has a primary mission around education, ensuring access to education, world-class research, and then community impact. In my current role, I lead the coordination of the procurement across the university system. So UC is made up of 10 different academic campuses, and my role is to try to coordinate as much as possible the procurement across those. We spend about $10 billion a year. And if you think about the campus, each campus is like a mini city. So the range of things that we're buying is everything from cleaning supplies all the way up to things like gene editing technology and cutting edge research equipment and things like that. So current role, in my prior role, I was buying primarily with CPG companies. So looked at things like ingredients and packaging and the things that help to bring products, to market.
Oh. So at one point you mentioned that across the 10 campuses, the spend is, I'm assuming you said 10 billion, right?
10 billion, that's correct.
Yeah, yeah, okay. I'm like, no, I misheard it as million. I'm like, no, it doesn't sound right.
Yeah, no, 10 billion. So UC is actually the largest university system in the country. And
Oh,
so, and in addition to the 10 campuses, the university also has 6 medical centers that are teaching hospitals that also are providing medical service to the community. And we also have a counterpart on that side. And so we also work together to try to collaborate as much as possible.
okay. Thank you so much. So, a part of your bio did mention that Two of the things that you specifically look into are sustainability and supplier diversity. Does that fall under your portfolio here, or you are responsible for it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so when we think about our strategic priorities as a university procurement organization, one of our top five strategic priorities, and in fact, the one that we prioritize first, is really around economic impact and responsible sourcing. So that includes sustainability and supplier diversity. We have some really clear goals and objectives around wanting to make sure that we are thoughtful in how the sourcing decisions that we make impact the economy of the state and the practices of the state. So in that, we're looking at both economic impact for small and diverse businesses, and then also making sure that we are including sustainability into our sourcing choices. We have a target to get to about 25% economically impactful sourcing for our spend. We're currently only at about 14%, so we have a long way to go. We have a lot of effort to try to improve that. And then we also have a target to get to 25% sustainable spend for within each one of the category, within each spend category. In our RFPs, we have a practice of applying a minimum of 15% of the points for the RFP towards the sustainability impact for the item. And that's true whether we're sourcing food or whether we're sourcing professional services and staffing. There's always a question or consideration for the sustainability impact of the proposal.
Paul, diving into the actual differences in the procurement strategies, you've served a long time in the private sector. What do you feel have been the major differences between the private and public sector, maybe in terms of cost, efficiency, risk management, across the board?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anu, and it's been really interesting for me to make the transition from the private sector to the public sector. Folks in the public sector, particularly in higher ed, tend to think that there's no commonalities between the two. The reality is there is a lot of commonalities. Like if we think of the university system, there's almost a direct correlation on the dynamics of, let's say, business units within a multinational and the campuses. So there's a lot of ways in which the dynamics of the different business units are the same as the dynamic between the campus and the collaboration there. But from a procurement perspective, there are some things that are notably different, especially for public higher ed. For example, the transparency of the process. So every RFP that we do at UC is public. Both the invitation to participate in the RFP is public, as well as the results of the RFP is public and very transparent. Any of the sourcing decisions are subject to like a Public Records Act request, and so someone has the ability to look at the RFP. There's even the ability to protest the results, which is something that you don't necessarily see in the public sector. In some ways, that's great because I'm always a fan of transparency. So the ability to have an even more transparent process is excellent. Although in other ways, it's somewhat limiting because when you think about the ability to have long-term strategic relationships, sometimes you make decisions that are not necessarily driven 100% by the score of the RFP when you're in the private sector. But you may say this supplier did not necessarily come out on top in the RFP, but there's a strategic reason or strategic alignment why we might want to still award a portion of the business to this supplier, or we might want to develop a supplier, based on future potential. And that's not an option that we have in the private sector or in the public sector because everything is transparent and 100% based on a predetermined criteria. Other than that, though, from a supplier perspective, I would say the dynamics are still the same. The most important thing is doing the homework, understanding the requirements, understanding what are the key decision drivers in the organization, and working to build relationships inside of the organization to understand how you fit far in advance of the RFP. are all still keys. That's true in the public sector and the private sector. Probably the one other thing that I would highlight for, so as a tip for a supplier wanting to do business in the public sector, is because it's so transparent, you always have the ability to go in and study the prior RFPs and the existing
Mhm,
contracts. And so
mhm.
there's a lot more opportunity for a supplier to do really thorough due diligence on the requirements ahead of the RFP process. And so that's one way in which, in some ways, it could be easier for a supplier to get a foothold or to have an opportunity to put a more competitive proposal forward for the public sector than you would in private.
Thank you. That was I loved your point on how you mentioned that in the private sector there could be times when, due to strategic reasons, we choose a supplier even if they don't necessarily score on top. Whereas in the public sector, is not the case. But at the same time, even in the public sector, the importance of building relationships is as important to
Correct.
understand the internal needs. Even if that's the only way you're going to understand what the needs are and work with them. So, thank you.
Mhm, mhm.
So, another question I had, and part of it you already referred to it. What do you feel are the primary challenges in each sector in procurement? How do these challenges influence the approach to your supplier relationships and contract management?
Yeah, that's yeah, great question. I think that w- one of the one of the things I really love about being in the public sector, particularly in higher education, is the lack of pressure for quarterly results. And so, in particularly in higher ed, the notion of academic study tends to permeate, throughout the culture, right? Additionally, as a nonprofit, we're not beholden necessarily to quarterly earnings, and so what that allows us to do is to take a longer term, more strategic view of decisions that are being made. There's also just within higher ed an appreciation for thorough study of of decisions before they're made. So in general, there's the lack of pressure around the P&L that you have in the on the private sector, and so it allows us to at times make kind of better, more thoughtful decisions on the public side. One of the things that I don't necessarily miss about the private sector is sometimes there are because of the pace and again the focus on quarterly earnings as kind of one of the key indicators, it can cause you to make decisions that are sometimes like shorter term decisions and not necessarily the best decision, long term. So that is that focus on the P&L is one of the challenges on the private sector that does not exist in the public sector. On the flip side, the lack of having the P&L as kind of the North Star can make the procurement process a lot more difficult in the public sector than the private sector. If you can make it make sense to the P&L in the on the private side, it's very easy to make a compelling case. Everyone across all of the business units is generally thinking of the same. They are going for the same objectives and have the same at least core motivators. There could be some more nuanced, motivators there, but the primary one typically is the impact on P&L. Um, on in the private side, because we're looking at education and research and community relationships and things like that, it requires you to really spend more time with the stakeholders, understanding what their key motivators are and what value looks like for them. And the definition of value for them may or may not be linked directly to cost. Often it's something else that is much bigger than just the cost of the item. It's the contribution to the research or contribution to access. For us, one of the biggest financial drivers that we have, again, is not necessarily like um, the the impact on the budget of the department. It also is how much are we enabling more access for students. So within our scorecard for procurement, we actually have included debt-free pathways. One of the things that we're very proud of at UC is more than half of our students, almost 60% of our students, are able to leave the university debt-free. 40% of our students are first-generation college students, and about 45% of our students that come from historically underrepresented communities. And so for us, one of the procurement drivers is being able to maintain a cost structure as well as negotiating things like grants and scholarships from our suppliers to enable students to be able to come through the university and leave debt free. And so that's it's something that's unique that we're also quite proud of here.
That response, I'm so glad I asked this because
Mhm.
I literally got chills when I heard you quote numbers like 40% first generation families, 60% of them graduate without debt, 40% from historically underrepresented communities. Those numbers are mind boggling. The kind of community impact and the very fact that it's great to have those quarterly results as a way to assess progress, but it also does limit your ability for longer term
Mhm.
strategic direction, which you were talking about. Never would have thought of it. Thanks, Paul. Loved that response.
No,
Uh,
thank you. Thank you.
okay, now I know I am going to ask you a question that you have done a lot with from your prior roles too. How do the two sectors differ in their approach to supply diversity?
Mhm.
You can start with how you want to define it for each of the sectors, however you want to look at it because I know that you did a lot of work even in Mondelēz, even though you were never directly a supply diversity manager, but you were definitely one of the flag bearers for us.
No, thanks. Thank you. I think there are a lot of ways in which the approaches are similar. Like I always tell people, like supplier diversity is just good sourcing. So if you were to completely remove the demographic elements of it, and someone were to say to you, there's a pool of underutilized capacity and capability in the market, it's just sourcing 101 to say that's where you want to go to look for additional value. And the data has proven that to be the case. I think it's like 30% diverse firms tend to give like 30% more innovation during a much more responsiveness. I think one of the things that I saw, I had the opportunity I changed organizations during the pandemic. So I started with Mondelēz and then I ended up joining UC. And both organizations, and I think this was common in the industry, found that during the pandemic, the agility of small and diverse businesses actually saved the day in terms of for things like PPE and being able to get supply during the time when supply chains were being disrupted. And so like I say this to say the value proposition for supplier diversity is the same in both sectors, in public and private. I think in the public side of the house, there's probably even more of an imperative because we're state funded. So we owe it to the state to make sure that we're thinking about the economy of the entire state, as we make our decisions. The difference in how we approach them goes back to this idea of transparency. So again, on the public side, you do have the latitude at times to think about supplier development and sometimes make sourcing decisions that are more of seed and investment in a supplier to grow them to be more capable, later on, or based upon just strategic alignment. On the public side, there's a very clear criteria for every RFP, and there's no latitude. Either you hit it or you didn't. The other challenge that we have is in the state of California, there's a law called Proposition 209, which prohibits us from assigning any points in the RFP process for supplier diversity. So we can do as much outreach as we want to ensure that everybody is aware of the opportunities that are there and everybody has an opportunity to compete for the business, but we cannot award any business based upon the fact that someone has diversity status. Even though, again, I think there's a very solid business case that supplier diversity helps with the long-term viability of the state. So the macro business case is still there and it's still the same, but on an RFP by RFP basis, we are not allowed to consider the diversity status of a supplier. in the award. So that's probably the two biggest difference. That's something that's not a public sector thing. It's a California
California.
public sector thing. So it's really interesting. Like when the Supreme Court ruling around affirmative action came out, um, a lot of folks were saying, "Oh, well, what are we going to do, and how's that going to change things?" For us, it didn't change anything because we have been operating in that environment since
Mm.
Prop 209 passed in the late 90s.
I did not know that. So, given that scenario, for diverse suppliers in who want to do business with the University of California, how should they approach? Is it mainly relationship building? What would you
Mhm.
advise to diverse suppliers in the University of California system?
Yeah, sure. And the advice that I would say, this applies to any organization. So whether it was in the public sector or private sector, Mondelēz, P&G, any company, um, I would say several things. One, get certified. Get certified for every for every certification that you're eligible for. So if you're a small business and a woman-owned business and a minority-owned business and LGBT business, get all of those certifications because it's helpful and it helps the buying side to identify who you are much easier as we're looking for potential suppliers. So first thing I would say is make sure that you're certified. Um, I say the second, but it's probably more important, is be competitive. Like at the end of the day, no
Mhm.
one is giving business just because you're diverse. Even in the private sector where there is more latitude to, based on strategy alignment, they're still not going to give you that business just because you're diverse. They're going to give you the business because there's a strategic long-term fit with the company. So, that's probably the most impactful thing is to remain competitive. The third thing is really to understand what does competitive mean for that organization. So sometimes it's cost, sometimes it's innovation capability, sometimes it's better service capability, sometimes it's even where the technology investments are going with the company. So understand the company or the organization, understand what are the requirements. I always say like think about what problem you can solve for someone to if when you're not the incumbent supplier, for someone to make a change of supplier from their incumbent to you, they are taking a risk. So there has to be some benefit or some reward for that risk. And
Mhm.
in most cases, it's something beyond just the financials. It has to be improved capability, improved service, et cetera. And so that's something that I think is true regardless of whether it's UC or public sector or private sector. Probably the one thing that I would offer for someone that is unique to UC is the fact that our prior RFPs are so transparent, so that when you're doing that, that's I think it's the third step I said of understanding the requirements. You have a huge advantage because it's all there, public record. Anyone can go in and look at it to really understand the requirements, um,
Mhm.
ahead of time. Probably one other thing I would offer, which is more of a soft skill thing, and this is not just UC, but for all business, is really understand how decisions are made within that organization and understand that it's going to take time. We sometimes have suppliers who go, "Hey, I got certified earlier this year and I haven't gotten any business since then." Understanding like we have typically like a 3 to 5 year sourcing cycle where business comes up for bid, every 3 to 5 years. It's important to start doing the due diligence and building the relationship and having conversations around the requirements, you know, in 3 to 5 years ahead of when that business is going to come up for bid. If we wait until the RFP is in place, it's too late. And then also understanding who has the decision authority. Is it the stakeholders? Is it the procurement organization? Is it the category manager or someone at the more senior level? So really understanding how decisions are made. I once had an incident where I was at Mondelēz. There was a diverse supplier who had an opportunity to get a sizable portion of the cocoa spend, which the
Mhm.
cocoa spend for Mondelēz is like massive. So we were really excited about this idea to get this supplier at least to the table for cocoa spend. And as I was introducing them to internal stakeholders, we set up a meeting with the CPO. The CPO then actually declined that meeting, but arranged for a meeting with the cocoa buyer, the global cocoa buyer. So
Mhm.
she had actually advanced them a step further in the
Uh-huh.
process. But the supplier took offense with the fact that the CPO had declined the meeting and got frustrated and wanted to walk away. And so that, to me, that's a great example of like misunderstanding the process of how decisions are being made. And it, caused a friction as they were just getting introduced to Mondelēz. They missed out on a big opportunity as a result.
Oh my, that is sad. That is sad. But
Yeah.
thank you so much. Those were some very useful ones that you shared with us. And at this point, I do want to hand over the stage to Michael because he would like to ask you a couple of questions around sustainability. Thank you,
Sure.
Michael.
Thanks, Anu. Hey, Paul. Firstly, as a father or a parent with two children at university, talking about debt-free students, I love the sound of that. I'm going to put them on a plane to California now and get them enrolled straight away. Yeah. You've touched upon really interesting points around diversity, and also you've touched upon sustainability and procurement. Sustainability is something I'm quite passionate about. What do you actually mean by sustainability and procurement? And importantly as well, how is it measured?
Yeah, great question. So, we for each of our major spend categories, there's a pretty clear set of criteria that have been established as part of the UC's sustainable procurement guidelines that determine and define whether or not that item is considered a green purchase within for that category. And so the things that are taken into consideration are things like recycled content, or or for example, single-use plastics in the supply chain for the item. And so for each spend category, we have a pretty detailed definition of what's considered a green spend. And then we have set as a target that for each one of those categories, we want to make sure that we are buying at least 25% green spend based upon those definitions. Some of them, like for our industry standards, so like LEED certification for construction and things like that. And then others are very specific designations that our sustainability team has come up with.
Okay. And do you actually, and I'm sort of coming off piece, do you continue to monitor those suppliers through effective KPIs based upon those sort of green purchase initiatives then?
Yeah, so we do. So we have a green spend report that we publish every year, which is an assessment of the items that are being purchased and those suppliers. We also partner closely with EcoVadis. So we have the EcoVadis is an industry standard that does an assessment of the suppliers' sustainability across a number of different metrics. So we use EcoVadis as like the baseline for our assessment of the supplier. And then we dig into the more detail on the specific items that we're buying from the supplier and provide that as part of the green reporting.
Yeah.
And we are working right now, and we still haven't figured out the most effective way to do this, but we also, in order to comply with some state statute, are working on a means of ensuring that we have the recycled content amount for every item that we buy. And so we're still trying to figure that out. If folks listening are aware of a tool that is helping them with that, please drop the link in the chat. And so I'll put a shameless plug for some crowdsourcing of solutions.
Yeah, we're seeing a big rise in the use of EcoVadis in the supply chain, and Ecology as well, another supplier in that space. The pressure to meet these sustainability goals, how does it actually affect supplier selection? Now, I know you touched upon, especially within the UC, not awarding suppliers based on diversity credentials, for example, but obviously in terms of sustainability goals and objectives, how does that affect your supplier management, selection and management within the public and your experience in the private sector as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that is one area. So while we're very limited in terms of what we can do within California for supplier diversity, on the flip side, we have a lot of latitude in terms of sustainability. So for each RFP, we actually, as a UC policy, are required to allocate a minimum of 15% of the points for the RFP. for the sustainability impact of the proposal. And so we're able to be very deliberate in asking things like, how does your proposal positively benefit the sustainability profile of the state of California? Tell us more. We can ask more about the supply chain that they're using to provide, to provide the good or the service for us. And again, that is directly included in our RFP scoring. We also do a lot at UC and invest a lot in trying to do things like introducing sustainable farming practices. So the university, for example, buys a lot of food. And we realize that we actually have the scale to try to help influence farming practices across the state. So I'm actually just coming from 2 days that we spent along with some nonprofit organizations like the Alice Waters Institute and Roots of Change, and organizations that are focused on sustainable and regenerative farming practices. And we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how we can collaborate with smaller, local, minority-owned farmers to meet the needs of the university, and also to help enable them to be able to adopt more sustainable farming practices.
That's one heck of a challenge. My son is doing agriculture at university, and a big part of this is about sustainable agriculture. And there's arguments on both sides of the fence. You mentioned obviously some of those sustainability criteria that organizations focus in on, and you mentioned sort of green purchases, recycling plastics, etc. Staffing services, are quite different. How can those criteria be balanced with something like the supply of services, especially around staffing, when we don't have single-use plastics, for example? And when you really need to focus in on a cost-effective staffing solution, how do you balance those priorities?
Yeah. No, that's a great question as well. And that's one of the ways in which I think partnering with someone like EcoVadis is very helpful, in the sense that they're looking at the entire business delivery model end to end. And so while there isn't necessarily like a finished good in the staffing model, there's a decent amount of infrastructure that all of the staffing services providers are utilizing to get the employees or the staff to us. And so things like whether or not they've got internal recycling programs, or whether or not they're paying attention to the equipment that they buy, and what or the buildings that they're building as part of their infrastructure for us, goes into the assessment of those suppliers. And my advice that I would give to staffing organizations is that there still will be an assessment, at least for UC, and I think for most organizations, there still will be some question around, what are you doing in terms of socially responsible programs and activities within your organization? And I think looking at things like the sustainability of the infrastructure to support the team is a great way to do that. Be prepared, I would say, to speak to that. I would encourage folks to take advantage of a third-party system like EcoVadis, because it's just it's clear, it's common, everyone understands it. I understand there's an expense associated with EcoVadis, but I think the return is actually, pretty good. One of the things we did
we are evaluating the cost benefit with EcoVadis actually at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, there is a cost there, but the benefit that it gives you is just a clear, objective score that folks accept and understand. One of the things too that I would encourage staffing companies to do, or all professional service providers to do, is go ahead and be mindful of and be able to report on the diversity even within your staff. So at UC, we don't necessarily ask for this because of Prop 209, but in my private sector roles, our large partners who were providing professional services to us, we asked them about what's the diversity of the team that you guys are providing to support us, and understanding that there, are the correctly proportional numbers of women in leadership, and that there's diversity represented across all of those. And so I would say a company could do themselves a service by being prepared to provide that, or even leading with the fact that they're tracking that information.
Yeah. I mean, it's a massive, broad subject, going from who do we use for our data center, is there carbon, how are we managing our carbon footprint, paperless offices, all of that sort of stuff. Um,
Yeah.
in terms of the sort of diverse supplier integration with sustainability, the sort of juncture at that, how can diverse suppliers integrate sustainability into their service offerings to meet the increased demand for environmentally responsible solutions?
Mhm.
And is that different across public and private sectors?
Yeah, great question. I think it's consistent across both. I think to the extent that the company, can afford, again, having a program that is already defined, being able to articulate the goals and objectives and the progress against those programs, is helpful. And again, I think I feel like EcoVadis should be paying me for this, but using
Yeah.
tapping into industry standards just so that it's clearly understood by others is also very helpful. But I would say that there isn't really much difference between public and private sector in terms of how to do that. And my advice would be, almost consider that a foundational part of doing business. So the same way in which, as a company is thinking about engaging a potential customer, there's a capability statement that talks about the specific business that you're doing. I would include also in that capability statement, just the things that you're doing already, for that relate to sustainability and supplier diversity, et cetera, and just make that part of the proactive, statement of the way that you operate, rather than waiting for the supplier or waiting for the customer or potential customer to ask about it.
Yeah, because I think I mean, I was going to ask you about the sort of the strategies that the diverse suppliers can use to highlight, their sustainability efforts and credentials. Obviously,
Mhm.
we've already touched upon EcoVadis, but if you are, for example, a small minority-owned business that can't, for example, afford
Yeah.
ecology, how
Right.
else, or what other strategies can those diverse suppliers use to highlight those sustainability initiatives, and especially within sort of when they're competing for contracts through RFI processes, etc., because that's a big challenge.
Yeah. Again, I think the biggest thing that they could do is be proactive in having a program in place at the scale of your business, and then proactively communicating that there's the program that is there as part of, the foundational conversation with the customer. So, you know, sustainability programs are things that you can scale up to the size of the business, even if it's a relatively small operation. A 10-person operation can have a recycling program, or some focus on making sure that they are considering sustainability when they purchase the, paper or the office equipment, that the things that are supporting the business. So even a very small, business can have some stated practices and stated values around supplier diversity that they're putting in place. And so my advice is, go ahead and build that into the DNA of what you're doing, and then be proactive in communicating that when you're discussing the value proposition to potential customers. So, most of those customers eventually are going to ask at some point in the solicitation process if you have a program. I would encourage, smaller and diverse businesses to be proactive in having that be part of the value that you're
Mm.
communicating to those suppliers, even before it's asked. And it's one of those things that, it scales to the size of the business. They should not necessarily feel obligated to put, a massive corporate the amount of resources in doing it if they're a smaller shop, but they can do something that matches and fits the scale of the size that they are. And, I would argue, like, if you do that as you grow, it's going to be part of the DNA of the company anyway. So it'd be better and easier for them to be able to do it.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you start with a 5-person company and you're already starting to measure your carbon footprint at that stage, it's a lot easier to do it then rather than when you're a 1,000 employee business. Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah, and the good news is like things like carbon footprint, there are calculators that are available, on the market. It's such an important part of business now that there are publicly available free tools that you could use to start to track your carbon footprint or even your travel. Most of the travel tools that are available right now will give you some visibility to what's the carbon impact of what you buy. If I go on United and buy airline ticket, I can actually see carbon footprint. So you don't have to have an expensive third party or a full-time sustainability resource on the team to put some of these practices in place that indicate that you're making this a priority for your business. And my advice to smaller and diverse businesses is build that in as early as you can and communicate it as early as you can, because it is part of the value proposition by which you're going to be assessed at some point.
Absolutely. Well, look, Paul, Annie's put her camera back on, which means we've probably run out of time. Hey, look, thank you for that. That's fascinating. And actually, I think really aligned with what our thinking is as we're growing, especially across Europe as well, because a lot of these initiatives are really coming to the fore now with new legislation. So thank you. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Michael, also for making sure that you managed to ask all the questions we had in the. I know I gave you less time than initially.
That's all right.
We have Kefun, who says very interesting insight on public versus private sector. I recognize a few faces in the audience. I recognize Lorena, who's from the NMSDC. She heads the Corporate Plus program. She's one of our huge supporters, joins in, and she loves to see how her larger MBs are putting their word out and encourages a lot of all the community impact work that we do, or in general, a huge support. So thanks for joining in, Lorena. I can see that Mark is typing in a question. Mark heads our corporate communications, and he has done a lot of work on the environmental aspect of our company. Whatever initiatives we have taken on, it is he who has made sure that we get the work put together. So he does have a question. He says there is a perception that public sector entities can write RFPs and or evaluate proposals in such a way to drive awarded business to incumbents or preferred vendors. In your experience, is there any merit to this perception, or do you believe public sector procurement is truly vendor neutral?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I've been in procurement for 30 plus years. You can always write an RFP in a way that steers the results in the way that you want. So it would be disingenuous for me to tell you that that is not possible to happen. It can always happen. What I would say though is that it's definitely it's not good sourcing, and it is not is not helpful to the buying organization to limit in that way. Part of the role, and I tell this to my team, part of the role of the procurement organization is to advocate for suppliers within the organization to make sure that folks are thinking through, and assessing all of the capability that's out there. And so that's, you hope that that doesn't happen. Is it possible for it to happen? Absolutely. It happens in the private sector just as much as it's just as possible in the private sector as in the public sector. But as much as possible, there, we that's part of the role of the procurement organization is to make sure that that's not happening, and that we are making sure that everyone gets a fair shake. I do want to highlight, I put 2 email addresses in the chat. The first is mine, and the second is the email address of the person who leads our supplier diversity, economic impact, and sustainability programs. And so if anyone wants to know more about the programs, please reach out to, his name is Abimbola Odusoga, or to me.
Thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate your time today. A lot of very useful points, and we will be posting this whole video on YouTube. And we usually do snippets of some of the more impactful things that we got out of the conversation today. We'll be posting it on social media. And so that's why I've posted all our social media channels. We are there on Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube. So follow us and keep in touch. Thank you so much, Paul. That was a wonderful
No, thank you,
conversation.
Anu. Thank you, Anu. It's been great chatting with you. And thank you, Michael, as well. Good chatting with you as well.
Great time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.